expire. And Brandon Arnold heads up as Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union. Brandon, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Biden has run around and he has said recently he's going to let these tax cuts expire. Do you think he's going to carry through on that? Because it doesn't seem like a great election year strategy.
Yeah, it's an insane election strategy. You know, I know he looks at a lot of these tax cuts and he thinks they all went to corporations and they all went to rich people, but that's simply not true. You know, the corporate tax rates are actually made permanent. The individual ones, and this is because of a quirk in the U.S. Senate, some of the arcane procedural rules we had to follow. The individual tax cuts are the ones that expire, and most of those are going to expire at the end of 2025. So we're talking about a little more than a year and a half, at which point we'll see not just the wealthy taking on huge tax increases, but working class Americans up and down the economic ladder. You'll see people paying thousands of and higher taxes if Biden allows this whole thing to expire. It's ridiculous.
And yet, just so people understand what you said, because I think this is hugely consequential, the tax cuts for corporations were permanent because of the way the law was passed. The tax cuts for citizens were temporary.
For individuals and also for small businesses that often pay taxes on the individual schedule, not on the corporate schedule, because they're too small to be corporations. So yes, we see small businesses, we see working families. Yeah, the rich would get a tax increase as well, but I'm more concerned, of course, about working class Americans that have been pummeled by inflation, by bad regulatory policy, that are having trouble making ends meet, let alone going out and purchasing a car or trying to buy a house or what have you. They're already spending thousands and thousands of dollars more than they were a few years ago for basic needs. And now what Biden is talking about is heaping even more of a burden on the backs of these people.
Brandon, you may have better numbers than I do, but the one I've tried to emphasize to people is they'll say, yeah, but the wealthy, they've got all those loopholes and deductions and this and that. And I said, yeah, but at the end of the day, what matters is what was the final bill paid by the rich guy? And so if you care and you say, well, as Joe Biden had said, the quote from him that I thought was so telling was that tax cut is going to expire because it went primarily to the wealthy and the biggest corporations. And you say, okay, if it went to the wealthy are paying less now, except that when I look at what the Biden IRS says, how much did you collect from the top 1%? For the tax cuts, I believe it was 40 or 41. Today, it's either 45 or 46. So they're paying more than 10% more in the final payment. So that's after the gimmicks, after the deductions, after the tax shelters, and after all the fun and games of 90,000 pages of IRS code, but they finally pay. The top 1% are paying more. And so I don't even know how a responsible reporter could quote the president as saying most of these cuts went to the wealthy when you say, but aren't they paying more and they were paying less before the tax cuts?
Yeah, that's the dirty little secret. Yeah, that's the dirty little secret that I don't think the left wants us to know, and that is the fact that the wealthy do pay a lot in taxes. We have a very progressive tax code here. The top 5% pay about 2/3 of the overall tax burden. It's ridiculous. The rich pay more in taxes than the less affluent. That's just how our tax system works. So many people back in 2018, they fell prey to this notion that they didn't get their taxes cut by the Trump tax plan or what have you. But if you look at the numbers today, and the Tax Foundation ran a bunch of these numbers, a single worker today making $60,000 a year, middle-class American, if we allow, as Biden said he wants, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to expire, they would see a tax increase of about $1,800 for a single year. $1,800, that's real money. A married couple, 3 kids, making $200,000 a year, so an upper middle class family, their taxes will go up by about $7,500. That's a massive tax increase for people that are not in the top.
No. So, and is there anything much that can realistically get done politically in an election year because otherwise this stuff just happens without Joe Biden having to lift a finger or his friends on Capitol Hill? Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to see some tax legislation passed this year. There's a bill to increase the child tax credit, to provide some incentives for companies to expand on domestic soil. These are all components that were in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act or are related to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, but it's just fallen apart, as you kind of allude to, due to political circumstances with the election. Nobody wants to do anything because they're afraid if they do something that they'll get beat up for it at the polls. So that is kind of fallen by the wayside, unfortunately. But we need to start this education process right now because it takes Congress forever to do absolutely anything. We don't know what the Congress will look like after November. We don't know who will be the president. And we really need the education process now so people know, hey, it's really important to renew these provisions if we want to keep our taxes relatively low, which is becoming really, really tricky given the current state of politics in Washington.
You know, one of the tax cuts that was made by the Congress and signed by Trump that I really hope people understand is called immediate expensing. And I'm not a tax expert, but I know how it affects me. If I work in a technological business, when I buy a piece of equipment under the current law, if I say, hey, we're having a good year, let's replace some computers, let's replace some of this other stuff that we've been waiting to replace, I get to take those costs that year against the profits that year. And imagine how this works in the average workplace where you say, why doesn't the boss replace this truck or that piece of equipment and make us faster and more effective at what we do? And you say, well, today he can take the whole write-off this year. In the future, he may write that off over 3 years or 5 years or longer, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. That's the exact type of policy that I think we need to help make sure we're educating voters on. It's critically important to small businesses, large businesses, all businesses. It's this notion that you shouldn't pay taxes on the investments that you're making, whether those investments in research and development, on computers, machinery, what have you, just the same as if you're investing in labor. If you're hiring more people, you're not paying taxes on the money that you're spending to pay those employees. That's not how the tax code works. It's not how the tax code should work. You first deduct out those costs, and if you deduct them out, what you're doing is incentivizing businesses to grow, to buy more machinery, more computers, to expand, to do so on American soil, of course, which is creating jobs for working Americans. So it's really, really critical. It's one of the things that caused the most growth after the 2017 law took effect. And unfortunately, that's one of the provisions that has already begun to phase out. It's critical that we get it back on the book.
And in fact, doesn't it all go away next year by the end of next year if nothing is done?
Yeah, pretty much the entire individual side, including those provisions to incentivize investments, will disappear at the end of 2025.
Brandon, thanks so much for what you do at the National Taxpayers Union. I appreciate your time. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Lars. You too.
That's Brandon Arnold, Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union. It's First Amendment Friday. I'll get to your calls in just a moment after the break at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. If you happen to be a naysayer, we'll put